Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Not Another Tooling podcast with myself, Austin Pearson, and my co-host on the squeaky treadmill today, Mr. Matt Malcolm. How are you, Mr. Malcolm?
Grand. It's not squeaking there, it stopped.
Yeah, awesome, wonderful. This is good. Good news. Right, so I've had a full-on week with clients this week, and one thing that really came out for me was the role of, let's call it the monitoring analyst, and how that is shifting and changing. And I know you've got quite a few views on this, but let me set the scene a little bit and then we'll dive into it. So there's a lot of people that were traditionally in what would have been a knock pre-COVID. They're there in the monitoring center, and they're looking at tools and trying to make sense of what's going on. And there's a whole kind of feeling that these people are not as engaged as they could be in their job, and so people are struggling to retain them. And when they're struggling to retain them, that means they've got to hire new people in who cost them more money, etc. But what I'm seeing people want to do is to help them shift from this old kind of school role of looking at a screen to more of an SRE and a sort of automation engineer type thing. But you've got to do that, you've got to bring the people along on the journey. There's a lot more value for the organization in doing that, but it's it seems to be a bit of a hot topic at the moment. So what are you seeing, Matt?
I mean, I'm just fairly nostalgic, really. So I've got the traditional analyst in mind where something goes pop, they roll up the sleeves and they go fix it. And I suppose the general frustration, maybe a better word, is I don't feel a lot of analysts are executing as much as they did in the past, whether it's because the expectation the tool's going to do it for them or just different skill sets, or I'm dancing around my words, trying not to offend, but I feel like analysts back in the day who are, I was one of the basic ones, would get stuff done when it needs to get done versus going down the path where you're going.
Yeah, which is interesting. And I guess that's a lot of that is it because things have changed so much? You've got more tools, they're more complex these days. It's not so easy to be the SME that you probably were when you were in charge of Tivoli or SolarWinds or whatever it was back in the day.
Yeah, it definitely is, isn't it? It is that reason. It is, but it's hard to connect to it.
Yeah, no, but I think you're right. There is generally a thing in the market that people are not as engaged as they were in previous years, and maybe that's because they're not the experts that they used to be. And so how do organizations start on that journey of, well, what do we need these people to be? Do we need old school monitoring analysts anymore? Or if not, what's the role that we do need, and why do we need that? And how do we sell that to the organization and sell it to the people to help them move into something that means we can keep them, I guess, which was a very, very big question there. I realize that I was saying.
I'm trying to answer like a couple of bits. Maybe it's just coming to me like appreciate like the older school way of doing things isn't necessarily the right way, and there's all these good, competent technologies in place to help work differently. I feel like with the level of I don't know, automation, cognitive ability, smartness, all of these tools offer, it's essentially making us skip a few steps in some of the more fundamental workflows you would normally have done in a monitoring or event management activity. You're almost expecting the product to just give you, that's it. And yes, some of them can, but then when it isn't, and you can't adopt it that quick, or maybe you don't have the right skills, that product or whatever it is, and you have to resort to traditional methods, it's lost. No one's had to do it. It's like you've been fast forwarded and you haven't, oh, what is this step? Versus if someone's got more rolls up sleeves experience of doing it, they know all of the steps, even though 7 of them are now automated. Versus the new analyst is like, I jump in at step 10. What? Step 7 didn't execute. Oh, which one's that one? You know, that's the, I can't articulate it any clearer than that, but I feel like someone with that old school way of thinking can leverage the new stuff, but they understand the context of why it's got there in the first place.
Do you know what? That's a really good point. And there's a great CTO that I was talking with recently who talks about monitoring as a discipline, and you, yeah, even with the newer tool sets, you still need to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve and how you get there and what the steps are. Even if some of them are automated, they need to be the right thing for your business. They need to achieve the outcome. You can't just let the tool go and complete the steps because it doesn't know your business, and you need to set it up right and still be the expert. But I guess the answer is a little bit different these days, in that instead of you knowing all of the steps and having to complete all the steps, you're helping the tool understand what you need, and your job is to get more out of the tool and typically higher levels of automation, right? So that instead of you having to go in and do X, Y, and Z, then it's doing it for you, but you've set it up to do that to get the outcome that your organization needs. Am I making sense?
No, I think that's really fair. A phrase passed by my mind then when you were saying that, like you would know all of the steps, but then having the automation on the later part of steps is fine. But like a Swiss Army knife, that's what sort of crossed my mind. Like a monitoring analyst of late would probably be able to have a stab or jump into many parts of that stage.
Yes, a Swiss Army knife is a good, yeah, is a good analogy, I guess, of somebody who could do all the bits and pieces and knows how they all operate, versus somebody who's just doing a little piece. And interestingly, I was talking to a really large client recently, and they were essentially reorganizing themselves as their monitoring team as an event hub and automation team. And what it forced them to do was they had to know what was coming from where and whether it was the right thing and whatever, so they could get it into the event hub, so that everything went through the event hub before it went into their ITSM tool. And then they could drive automation because they were so big that they could never go and own all of the individual tools, but they could own it at the sort of event hub level. But because they wanted to automate it, they had to know, oh yeah, that's the little penknife, oh that's the corkscrew, that's the can opener, all right, yeah, I know what that does, I know how that fits into the jigsaw. But that's quite a progressive way, I think, of looking at it, because most organizations don't look at it like that.
I like that. I like the analogy you used beforehand as well around monitoring as a discipline. That's a really good way to look at it.
Yeah, I think so, because we have to change something, I think, in the industry, and otherwise these people are going to get bored and they're going to move on to other things, and monitoring is not always the sexiest thing. I mean, obviously to you and I it is, but but a lot
more than you than me, I think. But yeah.
And I guess it, if we really thought about it, it goes back to the same old thing of like, what are we trying to achieve here as a business, and how do we use the tools that we've got better to drive higher levels of standardization and automation, so that your job really has a value to improving what happens in the business versus I'm just a monitoring engineer.
No, makes absolute sense. I don't know what that changes, because I suppose the difficult scenario would be people are buying the top really good products, genuinely good products, and just that's the result, that's the thing. So there's almost a degree of like not needing to know or have the discipline, or it's just that thing and I act on that thing. So if you buy those things at that level and you execute at that level, it's all good. But more often the case, you're buying at that level and you're not executing that level, so you need to understand that all the other stuff has to take place. That's like the biggest maturity gap where I see it failing, is they might have all the good stuff, but they haven't got the discipline or the stuff behind it. And if it doesn't work like it says on the tin, then you're in a broke state.
Yeah, I agree, because even the best technologies out there, you've still got to understand what your ecosystem looks like, what you're plugging into that, what, you know, how it all fits together and what the outcome is you're trying to drive. Otherwise, you're just plonking a tool on the top. And then when something goes wrong, you're a bit screwed because you don't really know how it all works. And therefore, it's hard to improve it if you don't understand really how it works. And there is definitely this mentality kicking around at the moment, particularly in more complex organizations, of, well, it's just easy. I'll just stick a layer of AI over it, and then that just does some magic. And
yeah,
and they've got no, and it, to be fair, in some complex organizations, it's a good sticking plaster for a year or two while you're trying to get it's like instant improvement, but then you don't really understand where your problems are. You're kind of masking them because you don't understand the process that it took to get there. I think. But it's also shifting. Like, are we going to see, is a monitoring engineer going to be even in existence in 2-3 years? Or is that going to become an SRE type or DevOps for AI ops role, maybe, or something?
It's multifaceted, isn't it? So let's go to the practicality of it. I think it's very difficult to assume that there'd be this sort of SRE type evolution of engineers, because realistically, there are a lot of organizations that haven't built their environments and applications in a way that would suit that kind of development of monitoring and engineering solutions. Just wouldn't work. That model wouldn't work. It isn't just a case of it's immutable and switch it off and restart. So you still need to have that more traditional layer of monitoring and management and fixing and stuff. So there's going to be a separation there of, like, let's call it legacy apps and new apps. New apps, I mean, I remember drafting a paper a while ago of, like, why would you start creating new services and applications if you had a dependency on a tool? Should be toolless. Like, should be toolless. Should be created that well. Can be toolless. So that's a different side. But the ones where they're going to be more hands-on or whatever else, I don't think it's a disappearance of that kind of role. Maybe there's more that role can do. Like, maybe not as basic as an activity it used to be back in the day, a decade plus ago. Maybe it's like they see the stuff, so they have an ability of analyzing data. So they're a bit of an analytical kind of person or something in the first case. They've got hands-on of the product to see that, to do something with it. But then most importantly, and this would be an evolution, I would think would be an amazing one, and it does happen with some people, is then do something about it. Like, that might be deploying some orchestration, some automation, something with it, which isn't essentially, oh, you've got a problem, pass it here. To have somebody that can have the information come in, understand it, process it, and then action it. Whether that's a monitoring engineer or monitoring and automation, I don't know what it's called, but that would be a fairly robust role. That one, I think, would be good for any organization to have somebody that can see stuff, understand it, and act on it. Very, very valuable. From that individual and the career and the keeping them on board perspective, we talked about the retention of staff. That's interesting. I can see something and do something with it. Versus, you know, back in our knock days, like, I can see stuff, I best call out the engineer, and that's when you actually make the phone call, you know, page duty or whatever for products and stuff back in the day. Like that's boring. That's like I'm watching a dashboard, you know, nothing. Oh, it's turned red. Better call these guys. Raise the ticket manually.
Yeah.
But Now, like if they could see it and do something with it, that's interesting. But there's some, I don't know what the right terminology is, but like you get a bit of a pat on the back for yourself that like something's come in and I've dealt with it versus flogging it off. I'll wait
Yeah,
for the next thing.
I agree. It's like it's that thing of, oh, I've seen that 10 times today. Well, actually, instead of me just keep fixing it or getting it to the right home for it to be fixed, why do we write an automation
Hmm.
and own that and make a difference, which you could then easily measure the difference that makes to the organization, and which is such a more valuable role. Like you say, you get that pat on the back, you get to show the organization some real outcomes, and you're coming to work going, oh, I'm actually doing something.
Hmm.
Same old stuff. So
It's not as well to dismiss the idea of more advanced technology or AI or anything like that, I suppose, because use all those things to like enhance a phrase I keep seeing pop up in different feeds and stuff is like augmentation, like that's where we want to be bringing these sort of augment what the user is doing, in this case analyst, versus replace and blow it up. Like just what can they do better? They could understand and interpret the data quicker, it'll be more easily presentable for them. Maybe at the same time it would get presented with a suite of tools and actions to go and do something. Maybe they could simulate the automation of what would happen if they press that button, but use all of the more advanced tools to augment that user journey for this versus swap it out. I think is
yeah,
probably the best way.
I agree, because there's still, although there's some magical stuff out there with AI and whatever, you don't want to just press the button and let it go do whatever it takes, because top 10 biggest files on a Windows server, it just goes, oh, I'll delete the biggest ones. Brilliant, thanks, that was my database. I need some humans doing some stuff and putting some thought around this to make sure it's right. Okay, so one other slightly left field thing on this topic is also seeing that the role changing, because seems to be a lot of federations. So there's a lot of, I own the application, and therefore I want my teams to be able to self-service monitoring, and then if we want to change it to do this or that or the other, then we'll go out and do that ourselves, rather than having to come to the monitoring team and ask them, can you make this improvement for us? And so therefore I think there's I think that's something that organizations, CIOs, are definitely talking about wanting to do. I'm not sure that anyone is really doing it yet. And therefore you're going to force a bit of a change, because those monitoring engineers are now out in the business somewhere, let's call it, versus in our little knock team. And so they'll have more time to be able to do this kind of stuff that we're talking about, of making improvements and driving high levels of automation, and being forced to be that Swiss Army knife, I think, that we talked about.
It's a totally obvious path for people to go. So I don't think that realistically is like this all singing or dancing tooling team, so to speak, for most organizations now. Very rare that will take place, I think, these days. But the model can still be achieved where you've got some control.
Yeah.
So I absolutely think that the service owners and their respective technology teams, engineers, devs, etc., should pretty much own that life cycle. Why would we interrupt it by adding in another team? That makes less sense. So I think how you come across that, like how you overcome that kind of scenario, is like some sort of best terminology, I guess, some sort of federated tooling team model, if you want to call it that. So everybody in their respective spaces own control what they need to do, but everybody adopts a certain level of governance and standards, some design principles, some how we deal with things. Maybe we wrong terminology, but maybe we patch it on this period of time. Maybe it's to these design standards. Maybe everything has to go to this system and monitored by this. Basically, apply the standards of the tooling team all over the tools, leave them where they are to be operated almost autonomously in their respective groups, but have the standards. That's the only way you can realistically do it, because you ain't going to get an all-encompassing tooling team that own everything, because there's always going to be outlying tools that exist there anyway. So don't even, there's no point. Instead, have some harmonious module that allows everybody to own their own stuff, but then operate it in a cohesive way. Yeah, probably some better words to choose there, but federated support model is the best way I can summarize it.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's been a little bit of a different one today, I think, and shooting some ideas around. But I think it's a good one because I think it's the sort of thing that people need to start thinking about. So in summary, then we've talked about the role of the monitoring analyst, we'll call it. How do we keep them retain them in the business? And in the old days, there were fewer tools and you kind of became an expert in your tool. Nowadays, there's a lot more tools and you're not necessarily the expert. But you can't expect the product to give you the answer. Monitoring is a discipline. You need to understand the process, what makes up that monitoring process and why it does, so that you can become a bit of a Swiss Army knife and understand what all the different parts do, and not just leave these tools to do their own thing, because when something goes wrong, you'll be a bit screwed. And then we talked about, what does the future look like? Is it going to be a SRE or DevOps for AI ops type model? And we think probably not. There'll still be some some skills needed, but they'll be moving more into an automation mindset rather than a typical looking after the monitoring tool mindset. And then there's this whole federation and self-service piece where actually the tooling team are setting standards and governing those standards. And so teams can self-service monitoring and do their own bits and pieces, but then the tooling team are making sure that the standards are met. They're looking at improvement. They're looking at higher levels of automation. So their role is changing. But with all of this stuff, as always, it's got to be with a mindset of, well, how does that improve what we're doing as a business? What's the measurable outcome of what we're doing? So have I missed anything, Matt?
Good summary.
Wonderful. Good. Well, be really interested in your views, as always, viewers. So stick your comments down in the chat below. We'd love to hear from you. If you disagree with us, even better. Always like that. And if you've got any ideas for future podcasts, future topics you want us to cover, please drop them in the comments as well. And we will definitely get around to talking about them soon. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Look forward to speaking to you soon.
See you later.